The Living Zen-podcast is a gift from the members and associates of the Victoria Zen Centre to you. If you enjoy it, please be sure to let your friends know about Living Zen. If you'd like to support our community, here are a few ways that you can do it. Download the Living Zen podcast app for iPod, iPhone, or Android. You can also purchase additional Zen Talks by Venerable Eshu on iTunes or Amazon.com. One of the most meaningful ways to show your support is by joining our Sangha as an associate. Your commitment of $10 a month will ensure that offerings like the Living Zen podcast and our online e-Zendo will continue to be available around the world to everyone with an interest in truly living Zen. To become an associate, please visit our website at www.zenwest.ca and click on the membership tab. Thank you for your support. Mumonkan Case 43. Shoushan's Zhubi. The priest Shoushan held up his Zhubi, which is a short bamboo staff, before his assembly and said, "You monks, if you call this a staff, you're entangled. If you don't call this a staff, you ignore the fact. Tell me, what do you call it?" Rumen says, "Call it a staff and you're entangled. Don't call it a staff and you ignore the fact. You cannot use words. You cannot remain silent. Speak quickly. Speak quickly." Rumen's verse says, "Holding up a short staff, faithfully giving and taking life, entangling and ignoring interweave. Buddhas and ancestors beg for their lives." So today we have a case. Shoushan is one of our ancestors, direct. He's about 5 generations after Linji. And this case, is so much more elegantly simple than the last one. And by the sounds of your chanting and energy at this point, maybe that's a good thing. So this case is fairly simple. As always, I remind us to let go of our externalist perspective of cases and to bring ourselves right down to the ground so that we can be present for the experience of this situation. So the priest Shoushan holds up his staff. And in this case, we can hold up any object, anything. Stone, staff, a flower, bell, anything we want. We can hold it up. And Shoushan says, "You monks," so we're all monks here today. We're all practitioners. Maybe we should say, "Oh, you practitioners. Hey, you! If you call this staff or a stone or a flower or a bird or a this or that, you are entangled. But if you don't call it a stone or a fish or a whatever, you ignore the fact. Tell me, what do you call it?" Shoushan is pointing out something which is pointed out over and over and over and over and over again in the teachings of Zen and Buddhism. And that is that everything that we experience, all experience, everything that we can experience, has these two activities, these two aspects. One we can call the subjective aspect or the divisive aspect, the discerning aspect. We can call a rock a rock. We can call a tree a tree. We can call a flower a flower. We can call doshu, Jeff. And this is true, but it is not the whole truth. It's only a very subjective, momentary, sort of one-sided perspective of what we're experiencing. And what we work very hard, what we point at so strongly in Zen practice is this other side as well, which is that fundamentally there is no thing that you can call a stone. There is no thing that you can call a bird. There is no thing that you can call a flower or a doshu or a Jeff in any kind of lasting, permanent way. There is nothing that you can lay your hands on that is the stoneness of the stone. We have to come to recognize that all of these things that we experience are activities, and that simultaneously they uphold both this subjective perspective, the stone is the stone, but also this absolute perspective, which is that the stone is not a stone. There is no stone to be pointed to. Kuo Nyamara Roshi, he uses the metaphor of a fraction so that anytime we're looking at things, we understand that we're looking at a fraction, and that the numerator is always this one. It's a number. It's a tangible thing. And this is one aspect of anything that we look at or anything that we experience. But for the denominator, he uses this emptiness, or like the denominator is unification. So we have, when we look at something, this fraction, so that we have both this one side which is subjective, which is identifiable, which we can call with a name. And this is often where we tend to use our conceptual mind, our discerning mind, our identifying mind. And then the other side we have is this absolute, zero, emptiness, shunyata. And in this experience of shunyata, there is nothing to be said. There's no one to say it. I say this stuff over and over again. I hope it's starting to sort of get to the point where I don't have to repeat myself so much, maybe. But we get the point here. We have this active and this dissolving, receiving dynamic in everything that there is. So, what is this case pointing at? In fact, I love this case because in many ways it is the essence of koan practice. It is the essence of all interactions, pointed interactions where we must be truly alive anywhere in our lives, not just with a Zen teacher, but anywhere with our lives. Anytime that we're confronted and we're snared between conceptuality and a feeling of a deeper unity or a deeper wholeness, where we find ourselves stuck. So to give an example, what he's pointing to here, what he says is, he holds up a staff. And he says, if you call this a staff, you're entangled. So he says, if you talk about this, if you conceptualize this as a staff, you're leaning too much on the numerator side, on the plus side, on the discerning, subjective, conceptual side. But if you don't call it a staff, if you somehow try to avoid or deny or sit there motionless, then you're ignoring what's in front of you. And in this case, maybe Shoushan would crack you one with this staff and say, "Oh, no staff. What's that? Huh?" So we find ourselves in this situation where, okay, this is a two-sided thing. We can't rely entirely on our intellectual conceptual. We can't rely entirely and be torn apart or dissolved, completely turned into soup on the minus side, because he gives this command, he gives this demand. He says, "Tell me, what do you call it?" Now, I wonder if it's actually what do you call it, or if it's like, say something, or, show me, demonstrate. Huh? And this is the role that we always find ourselves in when we come to interview, when we're doing koan practice, when we're doing these cases. We're always put up with this situation, whether it's a flower, or whether it's a tree, or whether it's a stone, or whether it's anything more complicated than this. We're always sort of dropped in the midst of this situation. Even Joshu's mu. What is mu? We're dropped in this, the middle of this situation, and it's always this case. It's always this situation. It's always, how do you demonstrate this without relying on the conceptual, divisive mind? If left to its own accord, which it will result in you babbling. "Oh, well, I see that the flower is this and I am that and one blah 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 blah." No, that's no good. Ding-a-ling-a-ling. Interview's over. The other side is, how do you manifest? And so we dissolve completely into the experience of unification. Whether it's a flower, or whether it's a stone, or whether it's a tree, or whether it's a bird, we think, oh, well, if I can't talk about it, if I can't use my intellectual mind, I'll just dissolve into completely unifying, complete zero, emptiness, manifesting. But when we do this, we also miss. We also find ourselves imbalanced. We find ourselves making the second mistake, which is ignoring the fact. The stone, the flower, where is it now? How do you manifest? So always the demand in Zen practice, always the demand in these cases, is for us to swallow whole the fraction, swallow whole both sides of this equation, both sides, both aspects simultaneously, and to respond, to demonstrate. And that's what keeps coming up. This principle, it comes up really early in the Mumonkan. It comes up in hanging from a tree. It comes up over and over again. It comes up again in the water bottle. What do you call that thing there? Is that a water bottle or a not water bottle? And we know how that monk responded. And there's a story of how a monk responded to this particular case, this particular challenge. And it is that, I think his name was Kui Sheng. And he, when asked this, if you call it a staff, you're entangled. And if you don't call it a staff, you ignore the fact. What do you call it? And this monk stands up and grabs the stick, breaks it in half, and throws it on the ground. And as it hits the ground, Shoushan shouts, "Blind! You're blind!" And it's said at this point that Kuei-sheng had a profound realization. It doesn't do for us to waffle. And this is the case that we find when we look at the case of hanging from a tree by our teeth. This question is asked by ourselves over and over again. What's the point? How do I go forward? What do I do here in this situation? Over and over we find ourselves completely tied, either by one side or the other. Either we can't decide because of the intellectual complexity of it, or we are unable to act because of the depth of the experience. Or sometimes we're completely bound, like a person being sort of quartered, drawn between two directions, and we're unable to do anything in this situation. And it happens in work when our boss asks us to do something. We can be completely paralyzed. It can happen in school, and it certainly happens in relationships when we're confronted on something and we think one side, the conceptual side, goes woohoo, and then the more experiential side, the more sort of the emptiness side, just becomes immobile, unable to do anything. And it certainly happens over and over again in the interview room when people come to confront a koan. How do you manifest unconditional love when you're seeing a flower? And people look. Can't move. Or maybe we indulge. Even though we know it's not quite on, we talk about it. Or maybe we indulge the other way. And it's not to say that this is good or bad. Not to say that one way is right or the other way is wrong, or that both ways are wrong and there's some other way that's right. But to really recognize that we haven't met the demand. We haven't manifested in response to the situation. We haven't taken up the challenge and done it. And we think about right, and we think about wrong, and we get frustrated and we get upset because we're always living in this world of right and wrong. We're always living in this world of yes or no. We're always living in this world of good and bad. So I can just imagine in very much the same way, just like in any situation, this form of Zen, it's not made, it's not put out there to make us at ease or to make us comfortable or to make us, So I imagine this community of people, just as any community of people that you can imagine. And always a very sort of strong discipline, always a very sort of strong structure within this community. So to hold out a teacup and say, if you call this a teacup, you're entangled. But if you don't call it a teacup, you're ignoring the fact. So what do you call it? And just like it's quiet here, I'm sure maybe Shoushan does this regularly, because it's a dare. There's a lot on the line if you open your mouth. Are you right? Are you wrong? Are you a fool? Are you the next patriarch? It all rides on this teacup. What do you do? What do you say? The practice is not about whether you can get it right or whether you can get it wrong, whether you're the next superstar or whether you're an idiot. It's about what happens the moment that teacup comes out. What happens the moment that your life presents itself before you and says, take it! Are you shackled by what's going on inside you? Does that voice of doubt, of hesitation, of fear, of anxiety, of history, does it all just clamp down on us to make us completely impotent, completely shackled, completely bound to habit? We've been presented with an anomaly, something that stands outside of the pattern, outside of our habitual way of living. And as I say over and over again, this is not life. This habitual way of doing things that we have, this autopilot, is what Mumonkan calls in the first case, living like a ghost. And so these kinds of challenges, the staff or the water bottle, we can sit and we can imagine, if that was me, I would do this, or it would be really clever if he did that. But over and over, we find that in reality, when we are confronted with such a situation, it's breathtakingly difficult to actually do anything. What these cases are pointing to, what all of Zen practice is pointing to, is that ability to allow that shackle, allow those bonds to drop from moment to moment, to be able to act spontaneously, to be able to meet the situation as it arises appropriately, embracing both sides. This is liberation. It's not, as we can see very clearly when we present this kind of situation, it's not liberation from something that has been imposed upon us from outside. When this situation arises, when we say, oh, what's that? We don't see jailers or big muscular people coming in to tackle us and keep us from acting. No. This is entirely something that we do to ourselves, something that we have conditioned ourselves and been conditioned through our experiences and relationships to be paralyzed in this situation. As we practice, as we're sitting, as we're doing this investigation of what's arising in this very moment, if we pay attention, over and over and over again, we see these bonds. Over and over and over again, we see these habits, these ruts, this conditioning in our thoughts and in our emotions. Some people Zen rubs very much the wrong way, makes them profoundly uncomfortable. Some people, from the moment that they come in the door, they just don't like Zen. They don't like the straight lines. They don't like the limits of color and expression. They don't like, having to wear this or having to do that or bow now. And we have to understand that these things, these responses that we have towards practice are not unintentional. This is a very difficult thing, particularly as an organization when we look at, how do we make Zen more appealing to people? How can we develop the membership of the Zen Center? When you've got something that fundamentally is aimed at rubbing people where they don't want to be rubbed, something that makes people uncomfortable, we have to understand that there is a reason, there is a point, there is a function for this practice which presses our own difficulties, which presses those shackles deeper into our skin so that we become more and more clearly aware of them. Because in the end, the more clearly we're aware of them, the more clearly we perceive that they have not been put on us from outside. They are not something foreign, something that we are powerless to do anything about. We recognize that these shackles, link by link, each gear of the lock, each loop of the bond has been created by no one other than ourselves, in our own experiences, in our own relationships, in our own interactions. So over and over again, Zen places us in this position where we are drawn between the concept, who am I? What is that? It is this, I am that, I do this, I like that, on the one side. And the other side of a very simple, very crucial experience that arises through the practice of seated meditation or unification. There's many ways to experience this dissolution into emptiness. And it's very easy for us as human beings to take one or the other as the whole. So at first, before practice, we perceive, for most people, we perceive this sort of differentiation and amassment of differentiation as being the objective. If I can have things, if I can make me bigger, have more of that, all this stuff as the solution to the problem. But then we see, maybe that's not the way it is. You gonna ring that? Yeah. So we start to practice. Or we maybe say, enough of this, I need to do something that's not about amassing. Maybe I'll play an instrument, or maybe I'll get a hobby, paint some pictures or something like this. And we have this other experience as a result, whether it's through meditation or one of these other forms of unification, dissolution. Fundamentally, the differences, the peaks are not what it's about, we think. We experience this sudden equality, dissolution, intimacy with all things. But then we say, and this is what it's all about. This is the complete picture. This is what I've been looking for. But we find that even if we have this experience, we can't stay there. That we're always fluctuating between this world of differentiation and this world of unification. Differentiation, unification. And so when we are challenged like this, it's very difficult to respond simultaneously in an instant, to give a turning word, as it's called, a living word, as it's called, to respond wholeheartedly, completely, both sides of the fraction simultaneously meeting this moment. Wu Men says, call it a staff and you're entangled. Don't call it a staff and you ignore the fact. He's just repeating what's already been said. And then he says, you cannot use words. You cannot remain silent. Speak quickly. Speak quickly. There's no space in these situations for contemplation. When we're challenged with something like this, our response is always to want to gap, to space, give ourselves some space. Let me think about it for a second. Let me just think about this for a second. I can't call it staff. And already we've died. This is when in classical Zen literature, dead man on the spot. This is what this phrase means. As soon as we've stepped out of the situation, and if you reflect on it, and if you watch, if you experience your life this way, you can actually feel it going on. Someone says, "Hey, this!" and we're there. Cuts! This shout, we're there. And then we say, let me think about what just happened. And we step back. We leave the dynamic unfolding of the moment and take refuge into the sort of dividing, divisive, self and other thinking way of being. You can feel this. You can experience this for yourself. So, when these kinds of situations arise, how do you manifest unconditional love as a flower? How do you manifest unconditional love when you're seeing a stone? How do I manifest my true nature as a tree? You have to manifest so wholeheartedly in that moment. There can be no space. There's no time. There's no opportunity to think, to discern, to come up with what would be what's the best answer. You can't even have the thought, what? There's only the response. Wu Men's verse says, holding up a short staff, faithfully giving and taking life. This is the Wu Men's prescription for what a Zen teacher should be doing. And he's giving Shoushan his sort of as close to approval, I think, as you can get. Giving and taking life. This is something that comes up over and over again in the koan literature as a metaphor for practice. I keep going back to the man in the tree. I think it's case 5, if my memory about the numbers of these is terrible, but case 5, I think. And even in case 5, it talks about, so this man hanging, you're a person hanging in a tree by your teeth, and your arms can't reach any branches, and your feet can't touch the trunk. I think you all know this case, probably. And then suddenly this other person appears at the bottom of the tree and asks, why did Bodhidharma come from the west? So this is this impossible situation where if you don't answer, then you are ignoring. You're ignoring something which is of crucial importance, because as we know, this question, why did Bodhidharma come from the west, isn't just this question. It's a fundamental why. It's this really core, what's it all about? And it's been expressed in a lot of different ways. What is the greatest teaching of Buddhism, or what is truth, or all of these things. Each of us has our own sort of rendition of that question. But fundamentally, I think it goes beyond the individual expressions and comes down to even beyond the why, but the question mark. Just this open, question. And when we're confronted with this, we have a choice. You can say nothing. You cannot respond to it. You can hang on to the situation as it is and pretend that didn't happen. But as we look at the man hanging in the tree, as we experience ourselves as the person hanging in the tree, we say, is this person alive? But if you open your mouth, if you act to respond to this, then you lose the life that you had. And the end of that case 5, says, you end the life that you have and you're born into true life, or something to this effect. The idea being that all of the stuff you think you have, all of the stuff that's so important, this self, differentiation, amassment, possession, all of these kinds of things, they're confused. They're confusions. Or as some people like to call them, they're delusions. So when we talk about taking life in Zen, this is the life that we're talking about. This sort of life of object, this idea that there is existing. There is this idea of self. And taking life is to chop this off. We die, the great death. And what is manifest is life. A life that we've never known before, that we can't express. That's what Wumen is talking about here. Shoushan setting up this challenge with his staff. Cuts a swath between life and death. And there's a bunch of dead people in every room that he holds up the staff, I'm quite sure. And maybe once in 20 years, once in 15 years, maybe once in his lifetime, someone is born. This is a monumental occasion. That's why we have this case. Entangling and ignoring interweave. This is just what I'm talking about. Not one, not the other. Spontaneously merging all things together, there is a dance, there is a birth, there is a light, the Big Bang. Yeah. And in this moment, where is Buddha? Where is Bodhidharma? Where are all of the successive patriarchs? In this moment, the idea of Buddha, or the experience of absolute Buddha, the personhood of Bodhidharma, the great patriarch, the great realized sort of progenitor of Zen, or the essence of the teaching that he gave, all of these things are consumed in a great fire of manifestation. This is what Wu Men is talking about when he says, even Buddhas and ancestors beg for their lives. There's nowhere for them to hang on. When we meet the situation of our lives wholeheartedly, completely manifest in response to the situation. Whether it's the teacup, whether it's a flower, whether it's a stone, whether it's a bird. Breaking out, splitting the sort of proverbial cocoon that's had us in shackles, giving life to a spontaneous moment of response. It's terrifying because there can be no knowing what's going to arise. There can be no knowing how that's going to be received. There can be no concern about past or future. So that's what this Shoushan's staff, this Shoushan's short bamboo staff is pointing to. So as we go forward in our practice, in our lives, in our work, in our relationships, be aware when the staff is being presented. Be aware when we're being asked to demonstrate. And practice the spontaneous letting go, entering into our response. Just completely diving in like a phoenix to be born anew through this manifestation, through a response. Thanks for listening to the Living Zen-podcast. If you follow Living Zen through iTunes, I would very much appreciate it if you would take a moment to let me know what you think about it by rating or reviewing the podcast, so that new listeners can also hear what you have to say. Thank you for your time and for your support.